Hello watch enthusiasts. Now instead I'd like to talk about a few watch brands which I believe to be very underrated. And this is sort of a pseudo follow-up to my one of my previous videos talking about what I believe to be the most underrated individual wristwatches on the market. Now I would like to point out at the beginning of this video that these watch brands aren't necessarily in relation to price, though of course I do take value into account. This is more with regards to whether they are simply overlooked by a vast number of consumers and buyers, and are underrated for what they offer. Now, equally, I will point out that I haven't included the many Seikos on the market, notably Grand Seiko or sort of standard Seikos or Presages. And this is simply because recently they have garnered a great deal of attention within the watch community, and they are truly wonderful watches and do offer incredible features. But I'll be sticking to more, well, at least less known brands and ones which I believe to be less well rated and less well known. Whereas Grand Seiko, for example, is really becoming a major name. Now, the first brand which I'd like to talk about is Eterna. And Eterna are quite a historical Swiss brand, which have produced a great deal of innovations, notably the first ball-bearing rotors in watches. Equally, Eterna is one of the few brands actually which will actually provide an in-house movement to smaller brands. So, for example, one's seen a few, I hesitate to say micro brands at the price they're selling them, but a few quite expensive, but, well, I'll go into these in a different video, but a few dive watches which have come out recently in the small brand segment, which use Eterna in-house movements with 65-hour power reserves and so on, rather than the equivalent ETAs or Solitas, which is an interesting thing to see, really, because seeing as Eterna are already not a very well-known brand among non-watch enthusiasts and outside that community, that they are providing movements to other brands, which is a rare thing to see a brand do. Now, the design of Eternas does vary greatly between models, but one thing that is a really very recognisable feature of these watches is the quality. The detailing on these watches, from the ones I've handled and seen, and equally from those which I've read the reviews of, the build quality truly is tremendous. Having held these watches, for example, a Super Contiki like the one you can see on the screen now, the finishing on the dial is truly superb, with a raised logo, which is raised in a sort of a gradual fashion to make those dots in the logo of Eterna really appear very three-dimensional. Equally, the markers follow this theme, which is something interesting to see on a brand like this, and really does show attention to detail. This really is mirrored equally in the finishing of their watches and cases, with regards to the steel finishing in the brushing and polishing. In terms of movements, Eterna is equally an interesting brand because they do produce a number of in-house movements, as I've said. Now, these tend to come into play in their more high-end wristwatches, but even so, in their watches from about the £1,500 mark, around that range of £1,000 to £2,000, they do use Solita movements, which, though some people may not like the fact that they're quite standard movements, they are regulated and modified by Eterna to really provide high quality, matching that finishing and general quality of the case and strap. However, the reason why I believe that Eterna are such fantastic value and have such fantastic horological value is that this is a brand which many people don't know. And I've asked a number of people, for example, in shops, in terms of comparison between other watches and Eternas, and a lot of people haven't known what Eterna are. And for a brand with such history in terms of producing movements, a fairly modern history, I grant you, but still a substantial history in terms of Swiss watchmaking, and a brand which produces watches which are very alternative, if you will, very different to other watches and have a very different style, and fairly individual styling. for their wristwatches, be they modern cues or more old-fashioned cues. This is a brand which doesn't follow the sort of trends that one sees in other watches in terms of design, and that's something which I respect. And I'm surprised these watches don't score more highly among many people. Next, we have a brand which I've long admired and think have produced some truly wonderful horological inventions, and a brand which I believe are highly underrated and overlooked by a lot of people. And this is Girard-Perregaux. And this is a brand which is, again, a Swiss brand which produce in-house movements of a very high quality and produce primarily dress watches in that sort of segment. But looking at resale value for these wristwatches, there really are very few buyers who go in for this brand. And that's simply because they don't hold in terms of their name against brands like Rolex and Omega. And this brand does focus primarily on dress watches and watches of that more simple and maybe even minimalistic nature. But I think they produce truly wonderful watches and have an incredible history, considering the lack of interest a lot of people have in the brand. Now, when talking about Girard-Perregaux, it's very important to really take into account the one innovation which they can claim, and this was producing the first production wristwatch. Now, this was in the 1800s, late 1800s, and was produced for naval officers to wear, to be able to tell the time quickly and at a glance, which was of course important in a military background and a military setting. So of course Girard-Perregaux really do have a major history in terms of producing watches which are what we would today call the modern wristwatch, which is a fantastic title to give to a watch brand. Now, in terms of their price range and their bracket, if you will, in terms of the watch pecking order or hierarchy, Girard-Perregaux really are going for a luxury segment, so aiming at the same sort of field as Audemars Piguet and Rolex. And the interesting thing is, though, that whereas those brands will, on the whole, hold their value if you buy your model sensibly, Girard-Perregaux will depreciate fairly catastrophically, which is really a sign of how underrated they are as a brand when they do produce in-house movements of a very high grade and extremely well-finished cases and watches with fantastic attention to detail and really beautiful dials. For example, I've seen several of their watches which were produced only 4 or 5 years ago, which have lost 2/3 of their value. And these are £12,000 to £14,000 watches, which are suddenly reduced to around the £5,000 mark, which is quite a remarkable drop and surprising for a watch brand of such heritage. This is also the case on the vintage market, and actually Girard-Perregaux has long been a brand which I've been looking at in terms of a dress watch, a formal dress watch to purchase. And this is because, really, in terms of the pricing, it's baffling why. Well, obviously, I know why we choose modern wristwatches in terms of technological improvements, but it really is incredible to see what one can get if one goes into the vintage realm of Girard-Perregaux. Notably, I've seen alarm watches in solid 18-karat gold selling for under £700, made by the brand 20 or 30 years ago that have been serviced and kept in very good nick, which is really baffling. Now, the reason why I believe Girard-Perregaux are so underrated is because, and I really don't hold this against them in terms of being a downside in my opinion, but I believe that the reason why they are so underrated is because they really do focus on dress watches. Now, whereas a lot of other brands around this price segment do produce a fairly even balance of sports and dress watches, Girard-Perregaux really are a primarily dress-oriented brand. I believe this is important because a vast number of people these days who purchase a luxury timepiece are looking for a sports watch which they can wear every day and enjoy regularly, whereas in a lot of cases these dress watches simply cannot. And that is why I believe this company is sadly not being bought from as much as one might think. By contrast, the next brand on this list is Zenith, and the contrast here is that they produce a great deal of very influential and have produced a great deal of very, very influential sports watches, notably the El Primero being the first automatic chronograph, which is it was a collaboration between a number of brands, but really spearheaded by Zenith, and this really is a massive point in terms of heritage for Zenith and their brand as a whole. But then, where Zenith are quite a well-known brand in the watch community, they, by contrast, once more, are nigh on unknown by a great deal of people who perhaps would rather purchase a Rolex or Omega for a similar price. And this is for a number of reasons. I think a lot of people have been persuaded into feeling that these watches are poor quality due to the fact that they often sell for less than retail at large discounts. But I believe it's this very feeling towards Zenith as a brand that has lowered their prices. However, whereas other watches are also reduced in terms of prices, Zenith I think I respect the most because of the innovation that goes into their watches. And of course, the El Primero chronograph is a watch which one can look at simply due to its technical and large history, but it truly is an impressive chronograph. This, in my opinion, is down to the high beat nature of this movement at 36,000 vibrations per hour, so 10 ticks a second, making for an exceptionally smooth running second hand. Now, obviously, this isn't comparable to, for example, a Seiko spring drive, but nonetheless, for a purely mechanical movement, this is very, very good. Equally, Zenith take on a very playful nature with their watches, willing to reinvent their classical designs, with open hearts, for example, and also, for example, in their aviation ranges, some very quirky, very vintage-styled aviation timepieces, which I think appeal to a lot of people, and I've seen a lot of people like the look of them, but for some reason there is a certain stigma around buying from Zenith, which I don't understand. Now, of course, there are more illustrious brands than Zenith in terms of what they've performed and what they've undertaken in terms of their existence. But nonetheless, I feel that Zenith are downplayed in terms of quality. When actually having handled them and having spoken to people who own these watches, I've heard very little other than good about their timepieces. Equally, in many ways, I would see Zenith as being a direct competitor to brands like Rolex and Omega in terms of producing really superlative watches, which provide interesting features and a great deal of functionality. But I think Zenith offer a very different take on these designs, perhaps more playful designs, which I appreciate a lot, and is why I believe this brand to be very underrated considering what they offer. Another brand which I think is grossly underrated is Glashutte Original. Now, for the sake of this video, I will just pronounce it as original, simply because I'm afraid I don't speak German, and I fear my pronunciation may leave a lot to be desired. So I'll stick to original, but in the comments down below, please do correct me on the correct pronunciation. But this is a brand which is based in Germany and has produced some wonderful watches with fantastic technological movements, with a great deal of complications, for actually a very affordable price considering what they offer. I say this because Glashutte Original do in fact produce movements which have very different layouts. For example, they have small hours, seconds, and minutes in one side of the movement, and then various other functions around the rest of the watch, making for a very interesting movement layout, and showing real craftsmanship in the decoration and testing of their movements for less than a middle-of-the-range Rolex Datejust, which I think is rather remarkable considering, well, that this is a smaller brand which is operating really quite tremendously to produce wonderful watches. Equally, Glashutte Original do produce wonderful vintage-styled watches, which are of course very close to my heart because they're those watches which I truly find beautiful. But generally they produce quite interesting watches which I think veer away from common trends in watchmaking and make for very interesting and conversational pieces, if you will. For example, this 60s model with the aqua blue dial takes that sunburst effect of watches from the past, and equally has a very Art Deco style numerals around the dial. I appreciate those came out long before the 60s, but do complement the dial very, very nicely. And again, that colour is a very bold statement, a very bold colour, but then is contrasted by a very tasteful black strap. So they really have designed some watches which I believe to be extremely beautifully engineered, but equally designed, which is something which shows a certain individuality in the watch world. Equally, in the higher ranges, they offer truly tremendous movement innovations with extremely complex movements, all handmade in Germany, and decorated beautifully and then regulated very carefully, which I believe do actually take on larger brands like Patek and Breguet at the field of haute horlogerie, in terms of producing these very high-class watches with a great deal of innovation and technology going into their movements. Now, to finish this video, I can see no better brand to talk about than Sinn. Now, Sinn are a brand which cuts in the lower price point than the other brands which I've talked about, and they're a brand which I think is often overlooked in terms of features and designs, simply because they tend to go for quite an austere look, a very no-nonsense, if slightly Teutonic look to their watches, which is very, very functional and doesn't really leave a lot to make their watches pretty, if you will, but nonetheless offer incredible value and are often neglected because they simply don't cut in with marketing in the same way that other brands do. Now, in terms of technology in these watches, there really is a lot to talk about. Now, whereas the other watches on this list have, on the whole, innovated with their movements, Sinn are innovative with regards to how they protect that movement. So that movement is usually a Solita movement or an ETA-based movement on some older models. So fairly standard and generic stuff, but it's the way that they encase that with their technology which is truly impressive. To see this, one needs only look at, for example, the case of their U1 and U2 and General U line. These cases are produced from submarine steel, where other brands producing watches at a similar price point, even more in fact, than this watch, substantially more, will use 316L, which is by no means a bad steel. It's a very good steel. But Sinn have decided to use something called submarine steel, which is a much more corrosion-resistant steel, simply because for their diving capabilities, they didn't see 316L as being good enough. Equally, technology like tegmentation is used to harden the cases so that they're much more scratch-resistant than other cases, which furthers that no-nonsense feel of these watches. And I think it's easy to see why these watches are perhaps overlooked by a lot of buyers, and that's simply because they don't offer a watch which is designed to be an accessory, if you will. It's designed to be a tool, which I think garners a lot of respect, but sadly this brand is overlooked by a lot of buyers. Another example would, of course, be their dehumidifying technology, which is used to avoid humidity damaging the movement inside a case if it does, if water ingress does occur, which is again a very functional and very well considered technology in a watch for under £2,000, as well as their association with the sea, which is so well demonstrated by their production of oil-filled cases, for example, to further the depth rating in their UX line. They are also known very well, primarily, I suppose, for their aviation work, because Sinn was originally a brand that produced aviation timepieces. And they do make a fantastic range of chronographs, notably my favourite, the 103, which takes on that very traditional aviation chronograph feel with the bezel. But they do also produce a number of other watches, again with very well-regulated chronograph movements with dehumidifying technology, but equally the feel of a classic watch with the technology of a modern-day timepiece. Another fact about Sinn, which really does bring in a lot of respect to the brand, which is that they don't produce quartz versions of their watches to make a less expensive version. They only use quartz when it's actually necessary to produce a better watch, notably the UX, where an oil-filled case would not work with an automatic movement. Anyway, I'll conclude my video on this picture of this beautiful 103, which I really do think is a tremendous pilot's watch. So thank you very much for watching. Do please like, share and subscribe if you did enjoy the video to see more on this channel, and to help the growth of this channel. I really do appreciate your kind support. But do please leave your comments on what you think could have made the list, or if you like my choices. So thank you very much for watching. This is I'm on the Watch Guy, over and out.